There is a particular kind of morning in early spring when the light comes into a barn at a low angle and makes the sawdust in the air look like something worth keeping. My son Thomas noticed it the same way I always had, pausing for a moment before he went back to what he was doing, the way a man pauses when he sees something that doesn't need to be remarked upon, but shouldn't entirely pass without acknowledgement. We were framing a window that morning. A simple double-hung, nothing ornate, the kind I had built several hundred times in 40 years of working wood in Montana. Thomas was 31 and had been building on his own for 8 years, well enough that I rarely felt the need to correct him. But that morning, I watched him set the frame flush against the rough opening and reach for his nails. And I said quietly the way you say things when you want them to land rather than bounce. Leave a gap. He looked at me. Between the frame and the surrounding wall, I said. 3/4 of an inch. Don't set it flush. He set his hammer down and looked at the opening, then at the frame in his hands. He was trying to find the reason in it before he asked the question, because that is how Thomas was raised and how good builders think. After a moment he said, "Thermal movement?" "Partly," I said, "but that's not the whole of it." He waited. I set my own hammer down on the workbench. I was 74 years old that spring, and my hands had begun to feel the cold in the mornings, even when the barn was warm, and I had been carrying a particular story for 35 years without ever finding quite the right moment to tell it. The window frame could wait. There was a woman, I said, up on the Milk River back in '86. She taught me something I should have already known. And I want to tell you about her before you build your first cabin without me watching, not because of the gap in the frame, though that is part of it, but because of the way she came to understand the thing I had spent 20 years not understanding. Thomas sat down on an overturned crate. He had learned, somewhere in his childhood, that when I prefaced something with "there was a woman," the story would take longer than a minute and was worth the time. The Milk River Valley in the autumn of 1886 was not a place that invited sentiment. It was flat country, genuinely flat, the kind of flat that you only fully comprehend when you have stood in it and turned slowly in a full circle and found no relief in any direction. The river itself was shallow and pale, more the color of old bone than of water, running east through grass that in a good year came to a horse's knee and in a dry year barely covered the soil. The mountains were visible to the southwest on clear days, distant and blue, and entirely useless as windbreaks. This is the essential geographical fact of that valley, and nothing I will tell you makes sense without it. The wind came from the north, from Alberta, from 1,000 miles of open prairie with nothing to interrupt it, and it arrived in the Milk River Valley at whatever speed and temperature it had chosen, and it did not slow down. In December and January, it could sustain 40 miles an hour for days at a time. In a bad year, it went higher. There was a February, I remember, not '86, an earlier one, when I left my cabin at mid-morning to walk to the woodpile 30 feet away, and by the time I returned, I could not feel 3 fingers on my left hand. We had 8 homesteads within 6 miles, if you counted the Bremner place to the northeast, and a small trading post at the settlement's edge where a man named Caldecott kept dry goods and a stove that 4 or 5 men could stand around without entirely blocking the heat. In the autumn of 1886, there were perhaps 40 people within a half-day's ride. Most of them I knew. Most of them I had done work for, or would. I had been building in that valley since 1883. Log cabins, primarily, 12-inch walls, fieldstone foundations, steep-pitched roofs for snow shedding. I was not a man who cut corners. The cabins I built were tight, well-mortised, with fireboxes sized appropriately for the interior volume. By the standards of frontier construction in that period and region, they were good cabins. I believed this. I had reason to believe it. The trouble with a belief you have earned is that it begins, over time, to feel the same as a belief you were born with. You stop checking it. It becomes part of how you see, rather than something you look at. I first noticed Nora Voss in September of that year, which is to say, I noticed the Voss homestead in a new way, as a place that now belonged to a woman alone, which changed how I looked at it without my entirely intending that it should. Henrik Voss had died in March of '85. He was a blacksmith, Danish-born, who had come to the valley in '81 with his wife and a foundational competence in ironwork that made him useful to every homesteader within 10 miles. He built a solid place, not large, a single main room with a sleeping loft and a lean-to for the animals built into the east wall, and he kept it in good repair, and he had apparently intended to stay the rest of his life, which turned out to be shorter than anyone anticipated. He was fixing a section of roof after the spring melt when something gave way and he fell, and by the time anyone reached him, the damage was done. He left behind his wife, Eleonora, Nora, everyone called her, and 3 children, Marta, who was 11 at the time of her father's death, and 12 by the autumn I am describing, a boy named Peter, 9 years old, quiet and observational in the way his father had been, and a small girl called Lise, not yet 3, who had no memories of her father that would outlast childhood. Nora Voss was 38 that autumn. She was a tall woman, not heavy, with the particular economy of movement that comes from years of work rather than years of exercise. She did not waste motion. She had come from the Schleswig region of northern Germany, near the Danish border, and spoke English with a precision that suggested she had learned it as a considered act rather than absorbed it casually. She was not a woman who invited sympathy, not because she was cold, but because she gave the clear impression that sympathy was a resource she did not know how to convert into anything useful. She had managed the homestead alone for a year and a half. I had ridden past it a dozen times in that period. I had stopped once in the summer of '85 to repair a door hinge that had rusted through, a small job, an hour's work, the kind of thing a neighbor does without being asked. She thanked me without effusion and fed me lunch, which was simple and adequate, and we talked about what the summer looked like for grass, and I went home. I remember thinking that she seemed to be managing. In September of '86, I had a reason to return. There was a windowsill I had installed for Henrik 3 years earlier that had been poorly protected from ground moisture, a mistake in my flashing, if I am being accurate about it, and I had known since spring that it needed to be replaced before another winter sat on it. I rode out on a Tuesday morning, arriving perhaps an hour after sunrise. I found her at the north corner of the cabin. She had her right arm extended, palm flat, fingers together, and she was moving it slowly through the air at various heights and distances from the cabin wall. She was not looking at her hand. She was looking at something on the ground nearby. A small pile of dried grass, the kind the wind deposits against any vertical surface in that country. She watched it for a moment, then looked at her hand again, then looked at the corner of the cabin where the north wall met the west wall. I said, "Good morning." She turned and acknowledged me and told me the windowsill was on the east side, as if she had been expecting me, which perhaps she had. I had mentioned in passing to someone at Caldecott's that I intended to come by. I unsaddled my horse and tied him and went around to the east side and looked at the sill. It was as bad as I had expected. I got my tools and began working, and for an hour or so I did not see Nora at all. Then I came around the corner of the cabin for a piece of material I had left at my saddlebag, and I found her measuring again, this time with a length of rope, stretching it from the base of the north wall outward, then driving a small stick into the ground at a specific distance, 18 inches, as I learned later. She did this at intervals along the north wall's length, then moved to the west wall and repeated it. I asked her what she was doing. She told me she intended to build a second wall, an outer frame of fence posts spaced 18 inches from the cabin, filled between with straw and wrapped in burlap sacking, floor to eave height on 3 sides, beginning with those that took the worst of the north and west wind. I listened to her describe this. I was a careful listener. It was part of being a good builder, I had always believed, that you heard a thing fully before you responded to it. So I heard her out. And then I went through it in my mind, the way I would go through the framing of any structure, The load-bearing questions, the moisture questions, the settling questions, the snow accumulation questions. Straw held moisture. Moisture rotted logs. An outer frame that settled unevenly would pull away from its moorings or bear irregularly on the foundation. Snow accumulating on an extended framework created lateral loads that fence posts unbraced were not designed to handle. And there was no precedent for it, not in the valley, not in anything I had built or seen built in 20 years of frontier construction. I said, "That's an interesting approach, Mrs. Voss." I said it politely. I said it the way you speak to someone whose reasoning you have assessed and found wanting, but who has not asked for your assessment. She looked at me for a moment in a way that suggested she understood exactly what I had meant by interesting, and then she went back to driving her marker stakes, and I went back to the windowsill. On the ride home, I stopped at Caldecott's. There were 2 men there, Harlan Brandt and a trapper named Ruck, who came through the area every few weeks. I mentioned what I had seen at the Voss place, not as gossip, as concern. I said that the widow was planning to build some kind of outer framework around the cabin and that I had doubts about the structural wisdom of it. Brandt asked a few questions and shook his head. Ruck said something about good intentions and bad winters and poured another cup. Within a week, Greta Holmsen knew about it. Greta was the wife of the largest landholder in the valley, a Norwegian-American woman who had spent 20 years building her position in the community through careful and generous attention to its social fabric. She was not a gossip. She was something more influential than a gossip. She was the person other women measured their decisions against. When Greta Holmsen expressed concern about something, it became the community's concern. She rode to the Voss place with bread and a look of genuine worry and walked around the half-started outer frame and asked Nora about moisture accumulation and snow load and what would happen if the structure shifted in the spring thaw. Every question was reasonable. I know because I had asked the same questions in my own mind, riding home from my afternoon with the windowsill. Nora answered each one, I was told later. Answered them directly, without defensiveness, with explanations that Greta found plausible but not convincing. Greta left looking the way a person looks when they have not been persuaded but cannot locate the specific flaw in what they have been told. At Caldecott's that week, the conversation was less careful. A man whose name I will not record said that a woman with 3 children and 1 winter's experience on her own had no business attempting experimental construction in a valley that did not forgive experiments. Someone else said something about Henrik's good sense not having passed to his widow along with his property. The laughter was not prolonged, but it was genuine. I did not laugh. I also did not say anything to correct what was said. That is the part of this story I have thought about most in the years since. Not what I believed about the construction. I have made a degree of peace with having been wrong about that. What I have not entirely made peace with is the moment at Caldecott's when I heard what was said and knew it was unkind and said nothing. A man who does not speak in those moments tells himself he is staying out of something that is not his business. What he is actually doing is making a choice about whose side he is on, without the honesty of admitting it is a choice. The outer frame went up through October. I know because I passed the Voss homestead 4 times in that month and watched it grow. Ragged, unconventional, nothing like any structure I would have built, but going up steadily. Fence posts driven into hardening ground, burlap stretched and tacked. Straw packed into the gap between the outer frame and the cabin wall. It looked, I will be honest, like something built by someone who did not know how to build. I know now what it actually was, but that knowledge took a winter to acquire, and the winter had not arrived yet. It arrived in November, and it arrived with intentions that none of us, not even those of us who had spent decades reading Montana weather, had fully prepared for. I should tell you something about how ideas come to people on the frontier, because I think it is commonly misunderstood by those who did not live that life. There is a version of frontier history, told mostly by people who were not there, in which the men and women who settled those territories were engaged in a continuous drama of survival and courage, making bold decisions against impossible odds. There is some truth in that. But it is not, in my experience, how most of the important thinking actually happened. Most of the important thinking happened the way all important thinking happens, quietly, alone, while doing something else in the small hours before dawn or the long hours of an ordinary afternoon when the work did not require the whole of the mind. Nora Voss did not wake one morning with an idea. She woke many mornings with a problem and let the problem sit with her, the way you let water sit in a cracked vessel to find where it runs out. The idea came later, and it came the way ideas come to people who have been paying close attention for a long time, not as revelation, but as recognition. I have seen this before. I know what this is. What she had seen before was a house in Denmark she had never visited, described by a man she had loved for 16 years, mentioned once in passing, on an afternoon neither of them had any reason to remember. This is what I have pieced together from what Nora told me and what Marta told me years later, and what I observed myself in the autumn of 1886. I cannot give you the interior of Nora Voss's mind with any certainty, but I can give you the outline of it, and I believe the outline is accurate. The summer of 1886 had been dry. Not disastrously dry. The cattle had water, the kitchen garden had produced adequately, but dry enough that the grass came up thin and pale, and the woodpile at the end of August was smaller than Nora had planned for. She knew what a Montana winter asked of a woodpile. She had spent 2 winters managing it alone, and the arithmetic was not complicated. What she had was not what she needed. She began doing the calculation in August. She continued doing it through September. It was not a panicked calculation. Nora Voss was not a woman given to panic, but it was an honest one. In a small notebook she kept for household accounts, she had written down, in her careful hand, the approximate consumption of the previous 2 winters. She had written down the current inventory. She had drawn a line under both figures and looked at what the subtraction produced. The number below the line was the problem. The problem did not have an obvious solution. She could cut more wood, but the nearest timber stand of any size was 4 miles west, and cutting, hauling, and splitting was labor that did not stop requiring itself regardless of how much you had already done. Peter was 9, useful, willing, but 9. Marta was 12 and strong for her age, but there was a limit to what 12 asked of a child without apology. Nora could hire a man from the settlement to cut for her, but hiring required money she had directed toward other necessities. She could burn less, but less meant cold, and cold at the level the valley produced in January and February was not a discomfort to be managed through extra blankets. It was a presence that worked on a person, on children especially, in ways that went beyond the merely physical. She had watched her daughters sleep in coats for 2 winters. She had watched Peter wake in the night, not from cold exactly, but from the low animal alertness that a body develops when it has learned that warmth is not guaranteed. She did not intend to watch it a 3rd time. She could attempt something different with the cabin itself. This was the option she had been circling all summer, the way you circle a decision you have already made but have not yet admitted to yourself. She knew the cabin's weaknesses. She had lived with them for 2 winters, and she had a builder's instinct, not trained but developed through close observation, for why they expressed themselves where and when they did. The north wall was coldest. The northwest corner was coldest of all. On a windy night, and most nights were windy, the temperature near that corner dropped several degrees below the rest of the room, and the frost on the interior log surface was thickest there, and the fire worked hardest to compensate for it. She knew the wind was the mechanism. She had felt it, not as a theoretical understanding, but as a physical fact absorbed through years of living in that specific spot, on that specific exposure, with that specific northern horizon. The wind did not merely bring cold. The wind took warmth. These were not the same thing, and understanding the difference was where her thinking began. She told me later that she had first heard the relevant principle from Henrik years before, on an afternoon in their second summer in the valley. He had been working at his forge, shaping a hinge fitting, she thought, though she was not certain. And he had been talking, the way men talk when their hands are occupied and their minds are running freely, about his grandfather's house on the Jutland coast. Henrik's grandfather had been a fisherman, and the house he built was situated on a low rise above the water with nothing between it and the North Sea wind, which was a different animal from Montana wind, but motivated by the same indifference. The old man had built the house with two walls, stone outer, stone inner, a gap between them filled with dried seaweed and loose sand. Not insulation in any formal sense. The stone itself conducted cold efficiently enough that additional insulation would have been largely redundant. The gap served a different purpose. The wind needs something to work on, Henrik had said, or words near enough to those. Give it something empty, something it can move through without resistance, and by the time it reaches the inner wall, it has spent itself. Give it nothing, and it finds the warmth on its own. Nora had listened. She had filed it away in the manner of a person who hears something true without immediately knowing what to do with it. Henrik was given to this kind of observation. He noticed the principles behind the things he worked with, the way iron behaved under different temperatures, the way a bellows angled correctly could sustain a fire for half again as long. He was not a formally educated man, but he was a careful one. He had been dead for a year and a half, and Nora had found in those 18 months that the things she remembered of him were not the large events of their life together, but the small observations, the passing remarks, the things he said while doing something else. Standing at the north corner of the cabin in September of 1886, her arm extended to feel the wind's direction and speed, she turned Henrik's grandfather's principle over in her mind and looked at what she had to work with. She did not have stone. She had fence posts from a corral Henrik had dismantled 2 summers past, the wood still sound, stacked behind the lean-to. She had burlap-grained sacking, years of it, accumulated from the settlement's supply deliveries, the kind that most people burned or used for rags. She had straw, more than her remaining cattle required for winter bedding, left over from a summer that had been generous in that one respect, if in no other. She had 18 inches of space between what the cabin was and what she needed it to be. It was not a plan, not yet. It was a question. What if the wind spent itself on something before it reached the logs? Questions of that kind either open outward into possibility or close back on themselves when you test them against available materials and physical reality. This one opened. She spent 3 days doing nothing visible. She watched the wind. She observed where the drifts formed after small storms, how the snow distributed itself against vertical surfaces, which directions of wind were most sustained, and which came in gusts that spent themselves quickly. She noted that the northwest corner, the coldest place inside the cabin, corresponded precisely to the corner most directly exposed to the prevailing flow. This was not surprising, but confirming it mattered. She wanted to understand the specific shape of her problem before she attempted to alter it. On the 4th day, she drove the first marker's stake. The building went slowly, which is the honest thing to say about it. Nora was not a carpenter. She had watched Henrik work wood and had done the basic repairs that any homestead requires, a loose board, a sticking door, a hinge that needed resetting, but she had not framed a structure before. And framing is work that teaches you its requirements through the teaching of mistakes. The first mistake was the straw. She began packing it on a Thursday morning in early October, working on the north wall, which she had framed first. The straw went into the gap between the outer frame of fence posts and the cabin's log wall, 18 inches of space, running the full height from ground to eave. She packed it the way she packed anything that needed to fill a space, thoroughly, pressing it in firmly, ensuring there were no voids. By Friday evening, she had the north wall done. On Saturday morning, she stood in the gap between the outer frame and the cabin wall. it was just wide enough to stand in sideways, and pressed her hand against the log surface and tried to feel whether anything had changed. It had not, or rather it had not changed in the way she had hoped. The log wall was marginally less exposed to wind, the outer frame was doing that much, but the thermal quality of the space between them felt wrong, dense, conductive. The straw, packed tight, was behaving more like a solid material than like the buffer she had intended. She pulled the straw out, all of it from the full length of the north wall. It took most of Saturday. She spent Sunday thinking, which on the frontier meant she spent Sunday doing other things while the thinking happened underneath. She churned butter. She mended Peter's second pair of trousers. She made bread. And somewhere in the making of bread, in the particular relationship between flour and air, and the way a properly made loaf has lightness because of what is not there rather than what is, she understood what she had done wrong. The straw needed to not move. It did not need to be dense. A tightly packed substance transferred what touched it, the same way a log wall transferred cold from outside to inside given enough time and wind. What she needed was air that could not circulate, pockets of stillness, air that had nowhere to roll or eddy or carry anything away from the surface it touched. Straw packed loosely with its natural hollow stems and irregular surfaces created exactly those pockets. Straw packed tightly eliminated them. She repacked the north wall on Monday, loosely, deliberately, allowing the straw to settle at roughly half the density she had used before. She stood in the gap again Tuesday morning with her palm against the logs. Different, not warm. She was not expecting warm, but the quality of the cold was different. Inert rather than active. A surface that was cold because it had not yet been warmed, rather than a surface that was cold because something was continuously taking its warmth. She wrote nothing about this in any document I ever saw. It was not the kind of discovery she would have thought worth recording. She was solving a practical problem with available materials, and she had found an adjustment that seemed to work better than what she had tried first. That is what she would have said about it if you had asked her. I know because I essentially asked her years later, and that is almost exactly what she said. Peter worked with her through October. He was 9 and therefore useful in the specific way that 9-year-olds are useful to a parent engaged in construction. He held things that needed holding, fetched things that needed fetching, and asked questions that forced Nora to articulate what she was doing well enough to explain it, which is a more valuable function than it might appear. When you can explain a thing to a child, you understand it. When you cannot, you have more thinking to do. He asked her on the 8th day of work why the straw had to be loose. She told him, still air holds heat, the way still water holds warmth on a cold morning. Move the water and it cools. Move the air and it takes. The straw keeps the air from moving. He considered this. Then, does straw know it's supposed to keep the air still? No, she said. The straw doesn't know anything. The straw just sits there. The air has nowhere to go, so it stays. That's all it is. He nodded as though this was satisfactory and went back to holding the post she needed held. On the 8th day, he also put a nail through the base of his left thumb. It was not deep, and it was not the nail's fault. Nora's hammer had glanced off the head in a way that happened sometimes when your hands were cold and your grip had shifted without your noticing. She cleaned the wound with the carbolic she kept for exactly these occasions, wrapped it firmly, and told him to go inside and help Marta with Lise. He went without argument, which told her it hurt more than he was showing. She stood at the frame for a moment after he disappeared through the cabin door, her hammer at her side, and looked at the work remaining. The south wall was not started. She had done the north wall and most of the west wall. The east wall, where the animal lean-to abutted the cabin, required different thinking. She wanted to include the lean-to within the outer frame if possible, to give the cattle some portion of the same protection. She had not yet solved the geometry of the corner joint where the lean-to roof met the outer frame. She stood there for a count of perhaps 30 seconds. Then she put her hammer in her apron pocket and went inside to look at Peter's hand herself. because she did not fully trust her children's accounting of their own injuries, and because there was a limit to how much work she was willing to do without him. The limit was smaller than she had expected. That was information she stored without examining it too closely. October closed with the west wall framed and partially packed, the east wall begun, and the south wall marked but not yet built. The mornings were cold now, genuine cold, not the suggestion of it. The ground was hard enough that driving a fence post required a methodology rather than just effort. She wet the soil around the intended location the night before, waited for it to soften overnight, drove the post in the morning before it hardened again. It was on one of those mornings, the last week of October, that I rode past the Voss homestead and saw her on her knees at the base of the east wall, working the clay seal along the bottom of the outer frame. This was her solution to a problem I had identified in theory and never followed to its practical conclusion. Cold air entering the gap at the base, below the straw, negating the effect of the buffer above. She had dug a narrow trench along the perimeter of the outer frame and was pressing a mixture of clay and chopped straw into it, sealing the gap between the frame's base and the ground. It was a sound approach. It was the approach I would have taken had I been building the thing. I slowed my horse. I am not certain why I did not stop. There was no urgency that morning pulling me elsewhere. I think I did not stop because stopping would have required me to say something, and I did not yet have anything to say that would have been both honest and kind. I went on. She did not look up. The south wall was finished on the 19th of November, 11 days after the first real snow. I know the date because I passed the homestead that afternoon and the work was complete. The burlap wrapped, the clay sealed, the whole structure standing in 6 inches of new snow as if it had always been there. The outer frame was not beautiful. It had the look of something built by someone whose primary concern was function and whose secondary concern did not exist. But it was square, and it was sealed, and it was done. I did not stop that day either. By then I had told myself on several occasions that my reservations about the structure were practical rather than personal, technical rather than social. I believed this, or I told myself I believed it, which is a different thing, and a thing I have had occasion to examine in some detail over the 35 years since. What I know now is this. The outer frame that November afternoon was built correctly in its essentials, incorrectly in none of its fundamentals, and would go on to do exactly what Nora Voss had designed it to do. It would do this beginning the following week, when the first serious cold arrived, and it would continue doing it through a winter that tested every structure in the valley in ways that a person who has not experienced extended deep cold cannot fully imagine. But I did not know that then. I knew what I had always known, and I rode on toward home through the new snow, and the wind came from the north, as it always did, and found no obstacle between itself and everything it intended to reach. I want to tell you something about Montana cold before I go further, because I find that people who have not wintered in that country tend to imagine it as a more dramatic thing than it actually is. They think of blizzards, of walls of white and howling wind, and the sudden violence of a storm arriving. Those things happen. I have seen them. But they are not the cold that breaks people or animals or structures. The cold that does genuine damage is quieter than that. It arrives without announcement, and it stays, and the staying is what matters. Not the temperature on any given morning, but the accumulation of mornings at that temperature, one after another, each one beginning where the last one ended, with no warmth in between to allow recovery. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was that kind of winter. It is remembered now by those who study such things as one of the worst on record across the northern plains, called, in some accounts I have since read, the Big Die-Up for what it did to the cattle industry across Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas. But that name and those accounts came afterward. In November of 1886, standing in a valley in northern Montana, watching the temperature drop a degree or two each morning and fail to recover each afternoon, we did not have a name for it. We had a feeling. The feeling was specific and physical, the way genuine dread always is. A tightening in the chest, a heightened attention to the woodpile, a new habit of looking north when you stepped outside in the morning. November did not announce what was coming. It simply began the business of it steadily, without drama, the way the most serious things in a person's life usually begin. Nora Voss had 2 problems remaining when November arrived, and she worked on both of them simultaneously, which was the only way to work when you were one person doing the labor of several. The first problem was the animal lean-to. The lean-to was built into the east wall of the cabin, Henrik's design, sound in its basics. A low-roofed shelter where Nora kept her 2 remaining milk cows and the 4 chickens she had not yet lost to the previous winter's cold. It abutted the cabin's east wall directly, sharing that wall as its interior north surface, with a corrugated tin roof sloping away from the cabin and open on its south face. It was adequate shelter for animals in a normal winter. In the winter she was beginning to suspect was coming, it was not. The geometry of incorporating the lean-to into the outer frame was the problem she had been turning over since October. The outer frame on the east wall of the cabin could not simply continue past the lean-to's roofline. If it did, it would create a sealed space above the lean-to roof where snow would accumulate and water would pool in the thaw. She needed the east wall frame to transition at the lean-to in a way that preserved the buffer without trapping moisture above the tin roof. She solved it by building the east wall frame in 2 sections. From the cabin's northeast corner to the lean-to's north edge, perhaps 8 feet, the outer frame ran at its standard 18-inch spacing, full height. At the lean-to's north edge, the frame turned and ran along the lean-to's outer face, parallel to the tin roof but lower, stopping at the roof's edge rather than continuing above it. She sealed the gap between the outer frame and the lean-to's roof edge with a folded strip of the burlap, tarred along its upper surface to shed water. It was not elegant. Henrik, who had an eye for clean joinery, would have found a more precise solution. But it was weather-tight, and it enclosed the lean-to within the buffer zone, which meant the 2 cows and the 4 chickens would benefit from the same dead air protection as the cabin's interior, or a version of it. Peter's hand healed in 4 days, which was faster than Nora had expected and slightly slower than Peter had hoped. He came back to work on the 5th day without being asked before breakfast, and Nora found him outside in the early morning cold, studying the lean-to corner joint she had been working on alone during his absence. He did not say anything about missing the work. He simply looked at what had been done and identified where he would be needed, and that was that. They finished the lean-to transition on the 10th of November. The outer frame was now continuous around all 4 sides of the cabin and the lean-to, with the clay and straw seal at the base on every exposed section and the burlap and tar transition at the lean-to roofline. The ventilation gaps, small openings she had left near the top of the outer frame, just below the eave line, to allow the slow movement of air that prevented moisture buildup, were screened with doubled cheesecloth to keep mice out. She walked the perimeter of the entire structure that afternoon. She stopped at each corner and looked at it. Then she went inside and put more wood on the fire and did not speak about it, and Marta, who understood when not to ask questions, did not ask any. The cold deepened through the 2nd week of November with the patience of something that has made its decision and sees no reason to hurry. I can tell you what it felt like from my own experience of those weeks, because I was in the valley through all of it, and the cold was not partial in its attention. It applied itself equally to everyone and everything, regardless of what arrangements any of us had made. The mornings went from cold to very cold to the kind of cold that has a weight to it, a physical pressure that you feel first in your face and then in your lungs when you breathe too deeply, too quickly. The river, which had been low and pale all summer, froze along its edges and then across its shallows and then, in the last week of November, across its full width. At Caldecott's trading post, the conversation changed. Through October, the talk had been the ordinary talk of men preparing for winter: cordwood inventories, livestock condition, the state of the roof on this building or that one. In November, the talk became more specific and more serious. Men who had been through difficult winters before were doing the same arithmetic Nora had done in August, and arriving at results they did not entirely want to share. The summer's dry spell had consequences that ramified. Thin grass meant cattle going into winter with less body reserve. Less body reserve meant they burned fuel faster in the cold. Cattle burning fuel faster required more hay to maintain, and hay was also thinner that year from the dry summer, and the interaction of these two scarcities, lighter cattle, less hay, produced a calculation that several men in the valley were doing privately and arriving at the same answer. If the winter ran long or ran colder than usual, there would not be enough of either to see the herds through. Harlan Brandt had said something in early November that stayed with me. He said, "Feels like a winter that means it." It was not a precise observation, but it was an accurate one. There is a quality to certain winters that announces itself early before any single temperature reading or storm event would justify concern, in the behavior of animals and the color of the evening sky, and some older sense that people who have spent many years in a particular climate develop without knowing how. The valley's animals were restless in November of 1886 in a way they had not been restless before. The horses were difficult in the mornings. The cattle huddled earlier than usual and did not unbundle from their groups even in the middle of the day when the temperature briefly moderated. Calvin Brandt lost his first animal on the 22nd of November. An older cow, which is not remarkable in a hard winter, the old ones go first, but it was the 22nd of November. We had not yet reached December. At the Voss homestead, Nora was doing what she always did, which was keeping records. I did not know about the seed catalog until January. She had taken an old seed catalog from the previous spring, burpees, if I remember correctly what Marta told me later, and in the back pages, where the catalog's designers had left several blank leaves for notes, she had begun recording the morning interior temperature of the cabin, the amount of wood consumed the previous day, and the observed exterior conditions. She recorded this information every morning in the small, precise handwriting of someone who had been taught to write carefully and had never lost the habit. She had begun the tally in late October, before the outer frame was complete, as a baseline. She wanted to know what the cabin's thermal performance looked like before the modification so that she would have something to measure against afterward. This was not a scientific impulse in the formal sense. She was not designing an experiment. She was doing what any careful person does when they make a significant change to a system they depend on. She was paying attention in a way that would allow her to know whether the change had worked. The October numbers were consistent with what she had observed in previous winters. Morning interior temperature, with the fire banked overnight, ranging from 34 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumption approximately a third of a cord per week. The November numbers, after the outer frame was complete, began to diverge. Not dramatically. She was not the sort of person who expected drama from physics, but measurably. Morning temperatures at waking, 41, 43, on 2 occasions 45 degrees. The fire banked at the same level as October. The wood consumption unchanged. She showed these numbers to Marta in late November, not as cause for celebration, but as information relevant to their planning. Marta was 12, old enough to understand a table of figures and what it implied. She looked at the numbers for a long moment. "Is it enough?" she asked. Nora looked at the seed catalog. She looked at the woodpile inventory she had written in the same back pages. She did the subtraction. "I don't know yet," she said. "The cold hasn't shown us what it intends yet." It was a precise answer. It was also, as answers to 12-year-olds go, not entirely satisfying. But Marta had been raised on the frontier, and she understood that the honest answer to many important questions was, "I don't know yet," and that the people who claimed otherwise were usually either lying or not paying close enough attention. December arrived on a Sunday, which I remember because Reverend Marsh was in the valley that weekend and held services at the Caldecott building, using the counter as an altar in the way he did when no more formal space was available. He was a circuit preacher, Marsh, traveled 11 homesteads and 2 small settlements on a rotation that brought him through every 6 weeks or so. He had been doing it for years, and he knew the valley and its people with the particular intimacy that comes from being the person people speak to when they cannot speak to anyone else. He rode out to the Voss homestead on the Monday after services, as he always did when he was in the valley. Nora was on his list, and he took his list seriously. He told me later in January what he found when he arrived. The outer frame was complete. He had seen it in previous visits in various stages of construction, had asked Nora about it, had listened to her explanation with the attention of an educated man who is trying to understand something outside his direct experience. He had not known what to make of it, which was at least more honest than the position of several others who had not known what to make of it, and had concluded from that uncertainty that it was wrong. He stepped inside to warm briefly before continuing his circuit. The temperature outside on that December 1st was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind from the northwest at what he estimated as 25 miles an hour. He stood inside the Voss cabin for 10 minutes, letting his hands thaw, watching the fire in the firebox. The fire was running at what he would describe to me as an ordinary rate, not stoked high, not fighting, just burning. He did not say anything about this observation to Nora. He was not certain enough yet of what it meant. He said goodbye to the children, left the small parcel of hard candy he always brought for the youngest on any homestead, and went back out into the December cold and continued his circuit. He did not say anything to me about it until January, but I think he was thinking about it through the whole of December, in the way a careful mind worries a thing it cannot yet explain. The middle 2 weeks of December were the weeks that established what kind of winter this would be, for those of us who had not yet understood it. The temperature dropped on the 8th of December and did not recover. Not a dramatic drop, not a blizzard, not a sudden storm event, just a new baseline established quietly overnight that proved to be the floor from which subsequent nights descended further. 18 degrees became 12, 12 became 4. By December 15th, the morning temperature at my own homestead had not exceeded 0 Fahrenheit for 5 consecutive days, and the nights were going to -18, -22. The wind did not stop. This was the critical fact. A temperature of -20 in still air is survivable with appropriate preparation. A temperature of -20 with a sustained wind of 30 miles per hour is a different category of experience entirely, and it is the wind that makes it different. I have tried in the years since to explain this distinction to people who have not felt it, and the best I have managed is this. Still cold takes from you slowly, and you can feel it taking, and you can respond. Wind-driven cold takes faster than you can feel it happening, faster than your body can register the loss and mount a response, and you do not know how much has been taken until it is already gone. The cabins in the valley were losing heat the way a candle loses wax, continuously, inevitably, at a rate that the firebox could barely match, and on some nights could not match at all. I was burning through cordwood at a pace that alarmed me, and my cabin was among the better built in the valley. The Rademacher family, who had a smaller firebox and a cabin that had been built quickly in their first year and never fully chinked, were in genuine difficulty by December 12th. I know because Harlan Rademacher came to Caldecott's that afternoon looking like a man who had not slept and asked quietly whether anyone had cordwood they could sell. Nobody had cordwood to sell. Everyone was burning what they had and hoping it would last. This is what December looked like in the valley, in the 3rd week of the month. This is the condition against which everything I am going to tell you about the Voss cabin must be measured, not against a comfortable baseline, not against an ordinary winter, but against the specific and serious emergency that the winter of 1886 was becoming for every family within 6 miles of the Milk River. On the 17th of December, Reverend Marsh found me at Caldecott's. He had just completed his circuit, and he was tired from the cold and the riding, and he sat down across from me with a cup of something hot, and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "I think you should ride out to the Voss place tomorrow," he said. "Bring your own thermometer, if you have one." I looked at him. "I'm not certain of what I observed," he said. "I want someone else to look at it." He did not say more than that, and I did not press him. I told him I would go in the morning. That night the temperature dropped to -28 degrees Fahrenheit. It was, at that point, the coldest night of the winter. It would not remain the coldest night of the winter for long. I lay awake for a portion of it, listening to the wind work on the cabin I had built, with my own hands to the best of my ability. The logs contracted in the cold, and the joints spoke. The fire in the firebox ran as high as I dared take it without risking the flue. The temperature inside, when I checked it at 2 in the morning, was 41 degrees. I thought about Marsh's face when he had said, "Bring your own thermometer." I thought about what I had observed at the Voss homestead over the previous weeks. The outer frame standing in the snow, the clay seal at the base, the burlap wrapped over the straw, the whole unconventional apparatus of it. I thought about what I had said at Caldecott's in September. That's an interesting approach. What I had meant, what had been said after I left. Then I stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it was not productive at 2 in the morning in a firebox-warmed cabin in -28 degree weather, and went back to managing the fire. At first light I saddled my horse and rode north toward the Milk River. The ride to the Voss homestead took 40 minutes in ordinary conditions. That morning it took closer to an hour, because the cold had a physical density to it that seemed to slow everything. The horse's movement, my own thinking, the very passage of time between one landmark and the next. The river was solid white to both banks. The grass that showed above the snow was the color of old straw, and moved in the wind with a dry, papery sound that carried further than it should have in the cold air. I want to be careful about how I describe what I found when I arrived, because I have told this story enough times to know where the temptation toward drama lives in it. The temptation is to say that I knew immediately, the moment I crested the small rise that gave a view of the Voss homestead, that something was different. The truth is more ordinary than that. What I noticed first was the chimney smoke. In a cabin fighting -28 degree cold, the smoke from a working firebox is thick and continuous, pushed almost horizontal by wind, a visible record of the effort being made inside. You could read the thermal condition of any homestead in the valley that morning by its chimney. The Rademacher place, which I had passed on the way, was producing a column that looked almost solid, dense, white-gray smoke driven flat and fast from a firebox running at its limit. My own chimney, when I had left it an hour earlier, had looked much the same. The Voss chimney showed a thin, steady thread. The color of it was lighter. The volume of it was less. It was chimney smoke of the kind you see in October, when the fire is lit for comfort rather than survival, when the wood going in is modest and the heat coming out is adequate for conditions that do not yet require more than adequate. I looked at it for a moment from the rise, then I rode down. Marta answered my knock. She was 12 years old, and she looked at me with the clear, assessing eyes that frontier children develop early, and she stepped back to let me in without particular ceremony because I had been to the homestead before and was not a stranger, and because frontier hospitality did not require elaborate performance. I stepped through the door. My eyes went to the firebox first. This was not a deliberate choice. It was the habit of a man who had spent 20 years reading fires in winter, who understood that the firebox was the thermal engine of any cabin, and that its condition told you immediately what the cabin's condition was. I looked at it the way a farmer looks at his fields when he comes over a rise, the way a doctor looks at a patient's color before he asks a single question. The firebox was running at an October rate. I stood looking at it for what was probably 5 seconds, but felt considerably longer. The wood inside was not stacked high and urgent. The draw was steady but not straining. The fire was doing the work of a fire in mild weather, not the work of a fire at war with something. And yet the temperature in the room, which I had not yet measured, which I was feeling only through the skin of my hands and face, which were still registering the profound cold of the outside air and were therefore somewhat unreliable instruments. The temperature in the room felt nothing like minus 28 degrees outside. It felt like October inside that cabin. Nora was at the table. She stood when she saw me. "Mr. Coldwell, I didn't expect you." I said something in response. I cannot now recall exactly what, something about Marsh having suggested the visit. I was still looking at the firebox. Nora watched me look at it, and I think she understood what I was reading in it, because she waited without speaking while I finished reading it. Then I reached into my coat and took out my thermometer. I went to the far corner of the cabin, the northwest corner, the coldest point in any cabin, the place where the north wall met the west wall and the wind pressed hardest from outside. I held the thermometer there for 2 minutes without speaking. 56 degrees Fahrenheit. I moved to the center of the room. 60 degrees. Near the firebox, 65. Outside, minus 28. The difference between inside and outside, at the coldest point of the cabin, was 84 degrees Fahrenheit. I had built 40 cabins in the Milk River Valley. On that morning, in those conditions, my own cabin, the one I had built for myself to my own standards with every advantage of my experience and training, was holding 41 degrees with the fire running at its maximum. I put the thermometer in my coat pocket. I did not check it twice. The number was not the kind that requires verification. "Your consumption," I said. "Since November 1st. Can you tell me what it's been?" Nora went to the shelf beside the window and took down a Burpee seed catalog, its cover worn from handling. She opened it to the back pages and passed it to me without comment. She did not explain what it was or how to read it. She left that to me, which was the correct instinct. A table of figures either speaks for itself or it does not, and elaboration before reading is presumption. I read it standing up, dates in the left column, in her small, precise hand. Interior temperature at waking in the next column, would consume the previous day in the next. Exterior conditions, briefly noted, in the last. The entries ran from late October, before the outer frame was complete, through the morning of the day I was standing in that room. The October numbers established the baseline. The November and December numbers told the story of what the outer frame had done. The wood consumption figures, which were what I went to first, showed 3/4 of a cord for the entire month of November. For the first 17 days of December, the coldest 17 days in recent memory, she had consumed slightly less than that. Total consumption since the outer frame was complete, approximately 1.5 cords in 7 weeks. In that same period, I had burned through nearly 4 cords. The Rademacher family had burned through 5 and were borrowing against their neighbor's charity to acquire more. I read the tally twice. I did the arithmetic in my head, checking it, arriving at the same result. Then I looked up. Nora was watching me with the expression of someone who has known a thing for a while and is waiting for another person to catch up to it. There was nothing triumphant in the expression. She was not a woman who found satisfaction in other people's discomfort, and the discomfort of a man realizing he had been wrong was not a spectacle she had any interest in. She simply waited. "I owe you an apology," I said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You were working from what you knew. So was I." I have thought about that sentence many times in the years since. She was right. And she was also not entirely right. I was working from what I knew. That part was accurate. But I had stopped at what I knew, and she had kept going past it. The difference between those two things is not a small difference. It is, I have come to believe, most of the difference that matters in any skilled work. She took me outside after that into the cold, and we walked the perimeter of the outer frame together. She showed me the clay seal at the base, the ventilation gaps near the eave line, the burlap transition at the lean-to roof line. I looked at each detail with the attention I should have brought in October when there had still been time to offer something useful, and I noted in my mind what she had solved and how she had solved it. At the north wall, she pushed open the small access panel she had built into the outer frame, a simple hinged section of the burlap and straw facing, just wide enough for a person to enter sideways, and I followed her into the corridor between the outer frame and the cabin wall. I want to describe this correctly because it is where my understanding shifted from intellectual to physical, which is a different kind of understanding and the only kind that truly persists. The corridor was 18 inches wide and ran the full length of the north wall. The outer frame was on my right, the cabin's log wall on my left. Above us, the straw-packed gap continued to the eave. The wind was audible on the far side of the burlap. I could hear it, a continuous low pressure against the fabric, but in the corridor itself, nothing moved. I put my left hand flat against the log wall of the cabin. I was expecting what I always felt when I touched an exterior log wall in deep winter, the particular bite of a surface from which cold radiates actively, a surface that draws heat from your hand faster than your body replaces it. I had touched 100 log walls in 100 winters, and I knew exactly what that felt like. This was not that. The wall was cool, genuinely cool, not warm. I am not suggesting it was warm, but it was cool the way a stone in a cellar is cool, passively, stably, not aggressively. It was not drawing heat from my hand. It was simply a surface that had its own temperature and was maintaining it, not bleeding it out, and not pulling warmth from anything that touched it. I stood with my hand against it for perhaps 30 seconds. Nora stood behind me in the corridor and did not say anything. She understood, I think, that I was arriving at something on my own and that speaking would interrupt the arrival. I said, "It's not that the wall is warmer, it's that nothing is taking the warmth away." "Yes," she said. And then, "The wall is the same wall it always was. The wind is what changed." I took out my notebook, a small one I carried for measurements, and wrote that down. My handwriting was poor because my hands were cold, but I wrote it. I have the notebook still. I told 2 men at Caldecott's what I had found. I was specific about it, not enthusiastic, specific. I gave them the numbers from the tally, the thermometer readings, the wood consumption figures compared to what I and others in the valley had burned in the same period. I told them the construction method in enough detail that a capable man could replicate it. I told them to go to Nora Voss if they wanted to know more, because she understood it better than I did, and there was no reason to route her knowledge through me. A week later, when 2 other men were discussing the approach at Caldecott's, and one of them was repeating the concerns about moisture and snow load that I had raised in October, I put down my cup and said what needed to be said. I looked at it in December. I measured it myself. Those concerns don't hold. It works. Not a little, a lot. If you want to know how it was built, ask Mrs. Voss. She'll tell you everything she knows, and what she knows is sufficient. Then I went back to my drink. I did not editorialize further. The men looked at each other in the way men look at each other when the most technically credible person they know has changed his position, and one of them put on his coat and said he supposed he would ride out that direction in the morning. That was January. By February, 7 homesteads within 6 miles had some form of what people had taken to calling Voss's Wall, though none of them said that directly to Nora, and she would not have wanted them to. The implementations varied according to what each family had available. The Thatcher place used dried creek grass and canvas from a collapsed storage lean-to. Someone else built an extended roofline on the 2 worst exposed walls that created a protected corridor without requiring a full outer frame. The results were not identical to Nora's, nothing improvised ever is, but they were consistent with her principle. Less wood, more warmth. More, the gap between what a fire could produce and what a wind could take meaningfully narrowed. The winter broke in March. The accounting afterward was painful for the valley and ruinous for some. Calvin Brandt lost more than 60 head. The territory as a whole lost cattle in numbers I have since read were catastrophic for the open-range industry. The Milk River Valley fared better than most, for reasons that were partly luck and partly the particular knowledge that had moved from homestead to homestead through the coldest weeks of the season. Nora Voss lost 3 cows. She lost them in a storm in mid-February when she could not reach the lean-to in time, and she did not speak about it more than was necessary to account for the change in her inventory. She still had her 2 milk cows, which had been inside the lean-to's protection. She still had 4 children, Lise, who was 3 and had not understood the full nature of the danger, and Marta, who was 12 and had understood all of it, and Peter, who was 9 and had held fence posts in October cold and put a nail through his hand and come back to work the next week, and the winter itself, which they had passed through together and which was now behind them. I began incorporating the dead air principle into every cabin I built from 1887 forward, not as a retrofit, as a designed element, built in from the foundation, a deliberate gap within the wall system that maintained still air between the exterior face and the interior cavity. I did not call it anything, it was simply how I built. When men asked about the detail, I explained the physics as Nora had explained it to me, standing in an 18-inch corridor in -28-degree weather with my hand against a log wall that was not doing what log walls in that valley had always done before. In 1893, Marta Voss married a homesteader named Albrecht and moved 8 miles east of her mother's place. I built them a small cabin that winter, one of the last commissions I took before I began reducing my work. The double wall detail was in it from the framing stage, not remarked upon, simply present, the way sound practice is present in good work. Albrecht noticed it when I showed him the drawings and asked about it. I told him where it came from. He nodded and said he had heard something about that, from a neighbor who had heard it from someone else. Marta, who was standing nearby, heard this exchange. She did not say anything. But she looked at me with an expression that I have thought about since, not corrective, not proud, simply aware. The look of someone hearing their mother's name not spoken and understanding exactly why it had not been spoken and deciding that this was, on balance, how things went and probably how they were meant to go. Thomas was quiet for a while after I finished. The spring light was still coming in at its low angle through the barn door, still making the sawdust look like something worth keeping. "What happened to her?" he asked finally. "She stayed until Peter was old enough to run the place himself. Moved to town, Miles City, I think, around 1901. I saw her once more after that in 1910. I was in town for a building commission, and I saw her at a dry goods counter. She had gone entirely gray, but she walked the same way she always had. Like someone who knows where she's going. Did she recognize you?" Eventually, I thanked her. I told her that I had used what I learned from her in every cabin I'd built since '86, that I was still using it. What did she say? I was quiet for a moment. There is a version of this ending in which Nora Voss says something memorable, something I could hand to Thomas as a lesson neatly formed. She did not say something memorable. She said something true, which is a different thing. She looked at me as though she was placing me, I said. Then she said, "Oh, you're the carpenter. Henrik always spoke well of your work." And she went back to what she was doing. Thomas looked at the window frame in his hands. "She didn't say anything about the winter?" "No. I think she remembered it. I think she simply didn't think of it the way I did. I thought of it as the winter she proved something. I have thought about it that way for 35 years. She thought of it as the winter she kept her children warm. Those are the same event. They are not the same thing at all. I picked up my hammer. The window frame was waiting, and the morning was not getting any longer. "Leave the gap," I said, 3/4 of an inch around the full perimeter, and when someone asks you why, tell them what it does. You don't need to tell them where it comes from." I paused. "Though, if you're the kind of man I think you are, you'll tell them anyway." Thomas set the frame in the opening and reached for his nails, and this time he left the gap. And we did not speak about it again. And the morning went on the way good mornings go, quietly, with the work in front of us, the light coming in at its angle, and somewhere north of us, the Milk River running pale and shallow toward the east, as it had always run, indifferent to what had happened on its banks, and what had been learned there, and what had been passed, imperfectly but honestly, from one pair of hands to the next.